The Concordat had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years using one simple trick. When they found a new species that could travel between stars, they studied how that species fought among themselves. Then they made those fights worse. They gave better weapons to one side. They offered special trade deals to another side. They whispered lies about who took what resources. A species busy fighting itself never became strong enough to challenge the Concordat. When humans reached the stars in 2217, the Concordat sent their best observers to watch. What they saw made them confident. Humans were perfect targets. Earth had almost 200 nations that barely agreed on anything. Humans spoke hundreds of languages. They followed different religions. They had different skin colors and argued about it. Their history books were full of wars that lasted decades or even centuries. The Concordat had never seen a species more ready to tear itself apart. 30 years after humans built their first faster-than-light ship, the Concordat made first contact. Ambassador Krellix arrived on Earth with a ship full of gifts. He was a tall, thin alien with 4 arms and skin that changed colors when he talked. He smiled often and spoke in a friendly voice. He told human leaders that the Concordat wanted to welcome humanity to the galactic community, but Krellix didn't make the same offer to everyone. When he met with the Earth Coalition, he offered them advanced medical technology. When he met with the Mars Colonial Congress, he offered them mining equipment that could dig 10 times faster than anything humans had. When he met with the Belt Miners Union, he gave them weapons and told them the Mars colonies were planning to take their asteroid claims. The Concordat worked slowly and carefully. They built trade stations near human colonies, but only let certain nations use them. They shared star maps but left out important details that would have helped human explorers. When disputes broke out between human groups, Concordat advisors always appeared ready to help. They always took sides. They always made things worse while pretending to make things better. 5 years after first contact, humans were angrier at each other than they had been in generations. The Mars colonies talked about breaking away from Earth completely. They said Earth governments were trying to control them from millions of miles away. The Belt Miners stopped shipping resources to the inner planets. They set up blockades and checked every ship that passed through. On Earth itself, the old arguments about borders and resources came back stronger than ever. Krellix sent regular reports back to the Concordat High Council. Everything was going exactly as planned. In his reports, he wrote about how human leaders from different factions were now asking the Concordat to support them against other humans. He predicted that within another 5 years, humans would be so weak that the Concordat could offer them vassal status. The humans would probably accept just to end their own fighting. The High Council was pleased. They had absorbed 847 species this way. Humanity would be number 848. They had already planned which Concordat species would govern which human territories. They had already decided how much freedom to allow humans. Not much, but enough to keep them from rebelling. It was a system that had worked for thousands of years. But in a small archive on Luna, Earth's moon, something unexpected happened. Dr. Sarah Chen was a historian who studied human wars. She was working on her dissertation about why humans fought so much. She spent her days reading old records and looking at patterns in human conflicts. One night, while reviewing trade agreements between different human factions and the Concordat, she noticed something strange. The agreements were too perfect. Each one seemed designed to create the exact kind of conflict that would hurt humans the most. When she looked closer, she saw the pattern everywhere. Every gift the Concordat gave created new problems. Every bit of help made human groups trust each other. Les thought Sarah remembered something from her studies. Humans had a strange pattern in their history. They fought each other constantly, but whenever an outside threat appeared, they stopped fighting and worked together. It happened again and again. Ancient tribes that had been enemies for generations would unite against invaders. Nations that hated each other would become allies when a third power threatened them both. She started looking at Concordat history, pulling data from the galactic networks that humans could access. She found records of other species that had joined the Concordat. She found the timing suspicious. These species always joined right after periods of terrible internal conflict. The conflicts always seemed to start shortly after the Concordat made first contact. Sarah brought her research to her advisor, Professor Marcus Webb. He was an old man who had lived through the last major war on Earth before humans reached the stars. When he read her findings, his face went pale. He made Sarah promise not to share this with anyone else yet. Then he made some very secret calls to people he knew in various governments. 2 weeks later, Sarah sat in a conference room deep under the surface of Luna. Around the table sat representatives from every major human faction. The Earth Coalition was there. So was the Mars Colonial Congress. The Beltminers Union sent their chief negotiator. Even smaller groups that barely spoke to each other had sent people. Sarah presented her findings. She showed them the patterns. She showed them the trade agreements and how each one was designed to create conflict. She showed them the history of other species and how the Concordat had used the same tricks for thousands of years. When she finished, the room was silent. A general from the Earth Coalition spoke first. He asked if she was certain. Sarah said she was as certain as anyone could be without direct proof. A representative from Mars said this explained why every piece of Concordat help seemed to make things worse. A Beltminer leader said she had suspected something but never had evidence. Then something remarkable happened. These people who had been ready to go to war with each other started talking about working together instead. They compared notes on their dealings with the Concordat. Every story matched the patterns Sarah had found. The Concordat had been playing them all against each other. An admiral named James Okonkwo stood up. He was from the African Union Fleet, one of Earth's larger military forces. He said that if Sarah was right, then humans faced a choice. They could keep fighting each other and become slaves to the Concordat. Or they could do what humans had always done when threatened from outside. They could unite. The meeting lasted for 6 hours. When ended, the leaders had made a decision. They would work together in secret. They would pretend to still be divided. They would let the Concordat think their plan was working. But behind the scenes, humans would prepare for something the Concordat had never seen before. As the representatives left the conference room, Sarah Chun felt both hope and fear. Hope because humans had realized the truth in time. Fear because she knew what the Concordat did to species that didn't cooperate. She thought about the 847 other species that had fallen for this trick. She wondered if any of them had figured it out like humans had. She wondered if they had simply figured it out too late. Ambassador Krelix sent another report to the High Council that night. He wrote that human conflicts were intensifying exactly as predicted. He never suspected that everything was about to change. The change happened overnight, and it confused the Concordat observers completely. Human factions that had been screaming at each other suddenly went quiet. The Mars colonies stopped threatening independence. The Beltminers opened their shipping lanes. Earth governments that hadn't spoken in months started having calm, boring diplomatic meetings. Ambassador Krelix reported this to the High Council with satisfaction. He said the humans had exhausted themselves. Their conflicts had burned so hot that they had simply run out of energy to keep fighting. This was normal, he explained. Many species went through a quiet period right before they collapsed completely. The High Council told him to prepare the vassalization documents. What Krelix didn't know was that every one of those boring diplomatic meetings was a cover. Human leaders met in secret locations, always underground or in shielded rooms where Concordat surveillance couldn't reach. They coordinated everything. They shared intelligence. They made plans. Admiral Okonkwo took command of what they started calling the Unity Project. His job was to bring together military forces from every human faction without making it obvious. Ships from the African Union fleet trained alongside vessels from the Asian Pacific Alliance. European defense forces shared tactical data with South American militaries. Mars colonial security coordinated with Earth-based defense networks. They did it in small steps. A joint training exercise here. A shared patrol route there. When Concordat observers asked about it, humans said they were trying to establish common protocols for dealing with pirates. The Concordat thought this was a good sign. Unified military procedures would make it easier to control humans later. Dr. Chen led a different kind of effort. She gathered scientists and engineers from every human faction. Their job was to study every piece of technology the Concordat had given humanity. What they found made everyone angry. The Concordat's gifts were full of hidden dependencies. The medical technology only worked with supplies that had to come from Concordat worlds. The mining equipment had built-in limits that kept human from extracting resources too efficiently. Even the computer systems had backdoors that let the Concordat access human networks whenever they wanted. A team of human hackers and programmers went to work. They reverse-engineered everything. They found the backdoors and blocked them. They figured out how to make the medical technology work with human-made supplies. They improved on the mining equipment and removed the limits. It took 80 months of constant work, but slowly, humans became independent of Concordat technology. The Concordat noticed none of this. They saw human factions behaving quietly and assumed weakness. Their arrogance made them blind. Then something happened that changed everything. A small alien ship appeared near Earth's moon without warning. It was old and damaged, barely functional. Inside was a single alien pilot named Vrix. She was from a species called the Torvan, and she was dying. Human doctors saved her life. When she recovered enough to talk, she asked to speak with human leaders privately. What she told them confirmed every fear Sarah Chun had uncovered. Vrix's species had been free once. They had reached the stars 3,000 years ago. Then the Concordat came. They used the same tricks on the Torvan that they were using on humans now. They divided Vrix's people until the Torvan were too weak to resist. For 3,000 years, the Torvan had lived as Concordat vassals. They couldn't make their own decisions. They couldn't leave their home system without permission. Their population was controlled. Their culture was slowly erased. Vrix had stolen a ship and escaped because she couldn't stand it anymore. She had spent 2 years searching for humanity because she had heard rumors that humans might be different. She brought something with her. Data files. Thousands of them. They contained the complete history of how the Concordat controlled other species. There were psychological profiles showing how the Concordat identified and exploited every species' weaknesses. There were military plans for crushing rebellions. There were economic models showing how the Concordat kept vassal species poor and dependent. Most importantly, there was a complete list of all 847 species the Concordat controlled. For each one, the file showed exactly how the Concordat had divided them. The patterns were always the same. The Concordat had been using the exact same playbook for thousands of years. Admiral Okonkwo studied the files for days. Then he called a meeting of human leaders and military commanders. He had a plan, but it was dangerous. He wanted to use the Concordat's tactics against them. The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Humans would pretend to fracture completely. They would stage conflicts that looked real to Concordat observers. Each staged conflict would actually serve a military purpose, letting human forces move into position without raising suspicion. The Mars colonies. would declare independence in a dramatic broadcast. But the ships they sent to enforce their borders would actually be taking up strategic positions near Concordat trade routes. The belt miners would see several Concordat vessels in what looked like piracy, but they would actually be learning everything they could about Concordat ship designs and weaknesses. Earth governments would appear to collapse into regional conflicts. But each conflict would actually be a massive training exercise. It was theater on an interstellar scale. And it required every human to play their part perfectly. The staged conflicts began 3 months later. The Mars Independence Declaration shocked the Concordat. Krellick sent urgent reports saying the situation was developing faster than expected. The belt miner attacks made Concordat trade ships nervous. Several started requesting military escorts, which spread Concordat forces thinner. When Earth governments started fragmenting into regional alliances, some Concordat observers actually celebrated. Behind the scenes, humans worked frantically. They built ships in hidden shipyards. They trained soldiers in remote locations. They developed new weapons based on what they had learned from Concordat technology. Most importantly, they prepared a message. Sarah Chun worked with linguists and communication specialists to create something unprecedented. They crafted a message that could be translated into every known language in the galaxy. The message contained all the evidence Fricks had brought. It showed how the Concordat had manipulated hundreds of species. It proved that the divisions tearing apart those civilizations were manufactured, not natural. They also prepared something else. A message of hope. Sarah wrote it herself, working late into the night for weeks. She wrote about human history, about how many times humans had been divided and conquered, about how they learned, slowly and painfully, that unity was stronger than division, about how the same enemies who fought each other for centuries could become friends when they recognized their common humanity. She wrote the message for every species suffering under Concordat control. She wanted them to know that resistance was possible, that they hadn't failed because they were weak. They had failed because they were fighting a system designed over thousands of years to exploit their divisions. While Sarah wrote, Admiral Okonkwo positioned his forces. Human ships moved quietly into Concordat space, using the chaos of the staged conflicts as cover. They made contact with ships from other vassal species. Some of those captains were like Vricks, tired of Concordat control. Some were just confused when humans started telling them the truth about what the Concordat had done. Not all of them believed the humans at first. The Concordat had spent thousands of years convincing vassal species that their situation was their own fault, that they had failed because they were inferior. Breaking through that conditioning was hard, but humans kept trying. They showed the evidence. They shared Vrix's data files. They explained that every vassal species had been manipulated the same way. Slowly, carefully, they built a network of species that knew the truth. Ambassador Krellick reported to the High Council that humanity was collapsing on schedule. He said they would be ready for formal vassalization within 6 months. The High Council began preparing for a ceremony on their capital world. They would make humanity's submission public, as they always did. A reminder to the galaxy of Concordat power. They sent out invitations to representatives from all major Concordat species. They prepared speeches about welcoming humanity to the galactic community. They even had medals made for human leaders who cooperated with the transition. What they didn't prepare for was the possibility that humans had learned from history. Not just human history, but the history of every species the Concordat had conquered. Humans had studied every page of the Concordat's playbook because they had written most of those pages themselves thousands of years ago on Earth. Divide and conquer. Exploit weakness. Turn allies into enemies. Humans knew these tactics because humans had invented them. The Concordat had used human strategies against humans, never realizing that humans had also learned how to counter those strategies. how to recognize manipulation, how to build unity despite differences, how to turn apparent weakness into hidden strength. As the date for the ceremony approached, Admiral Okonkwo looked at the positions of his ships on a tactical display. Human forces were scattered across a dozen systems, hidden in asteroid fields and nebulae, waiting. Vassal species that knew the truth were ready. The message was prepared for broadcast. Everything was in place. The Concordat thought they were about to celebrate victory number 848. They had no idea they were walking into a trap set by a species they had underestimated. From the start, the ceremony was scheduled for midday on Talaxis Prime, the Concordat capital world. Representatives from every major Concordat species filled the Grand Assembly Hall. The building was ancient, built from stone that predated spaceflight. Hundreds of species had been inducted into the Concordat here over thousands of years. Today would mark humanity's turn. Ambassador Krelix stood at the front of the hall, reviewing his speech. He would welcome humanity to the galactic community. He would praise their decision to join the Concordat. He would carefully avoid mentioning how the Concordat had manipulated them into this position. The ceremony was always phrased as if the new vassal species had chosen to join willingly. Human representatives arrived on schedule. But something was wrong. Every human faction had sent delegates. The Earth Coalition was there. So were the Mars colonies, the Beltmyers Union, the Asian Pacific Alliance, the African Union, the European Federation. Groups that supposedly hated each other all arrived together on the same ships. Krelix felt the first stirring of unease, but he pushed it aside. Sometimes species made one last show of unity before accepting vassalization. It changed nothing. The ceremony began. Krelix gave his prepared remarks. He talked about the wisdom of cooperation and the benefits of joining a civilization that had lasted 10,000 years. He gestured to the banners hanging from the ceiling, each one representing a species that had joined the Concordat. Soon, he said, a human banner would hang there too. Then it was humanity's turn to speak. Admiral Okonkwo walked to the podium. He was a tall man with gray hair and calm eyes. He looked at the assembled Concordat representatives for a long moment. Then he spoke. He said humanity had learned a great deal about the Concordat over the past years. He said humans had studied the trade agreements and the gifts and the careful manipulation of human conflicts. He said humans had noticed how every piece of Concordat help seemed designed to make things worse instead of better. Krelix tried to interrupt, but Okonkwo kept talking. He said humanity had also learned about the other 847 species the Concordat controlled. He said humans had discovered that every one of those species had been divided and conquered using the exact same tactics the Concordat had tried on humanity. Then Okonkwo pressed a button on his datapad. Every screen in the assembly hall lit up. Every communication device in Concordat space began receiving the same broadcast. Sarah Chun's message went out to 1,000 worlds at once, translated into hundreds of languages. The message contained everything. Rix's data files showing how the Concordat manipulated species. Historical records proving that vassal species divisions had been manufactured. Communications intercepts showing Concordat agents deliberately creating conflicts. Economic analyses showing how the Concordat kept vassal species poor and dependent. But most importantly, the message contained hope. Sarah's words reached across the galaxy. She told vassal species that their failures weren't their fault. She explained that the Concordat had spent thousands of years perfecting these tactics. She said that resistance was possible if species worked together instead of fighting each other. In the assembly hall, chaos erupted. Representatives from vassal species began shouting. Some were angry at the Concordat. Others were angry at the humans for disrupting the ceremony. Concordat officials tried to shut down the broadcast, but it was coming from multiple sources. Human ships scattered across Concordat space were all transmitting. Krelix turned to face Okonkwo. His skin flashed angry red colors. He said this was an act of war. He said humanity would be crushed for this insult. He called for Concordat security forces to arrest all human representatives. That's when the second message came through. This one was from Admiral Okonkwo's fleet. Human warships had taken positions throughout Concordat space. They weren't attacking, but they were ready to defend themselves. And they weren't alone. Ships from vassal species were positioning themselves alongside human vessels. The Torvin had sent their small defense fleet. The Kelvin, whose world had been conquered 4,000 years ago, sent their ships. Dozens of other species were joining them. The High Council convened in emergency session. They ordered their military to crush the human threat immediately. The Concordat fleet was massive. Thousands of ships built over millennia. They had never lost a major battle. But the Concordat had never fought a coordinated enemy before. They were used to fighting divided, disorganized resistance from newly conquered species. They expected battles to be easy. The Battle of Talaxis Prime began 3 hours after Okonkwo's speech. Concordat ships moved to attack the human fleet positions. What they found shocked them. Human ships fought in tight formations, covering each other's weaknesses. They used tactics that seemed to predict Concordat movements before they happened. When Concordat ships tried to divide human forces, the humans refused to take the bait. The battle lasted 3 days. Human ships were outnumbered, but they were coordinated in ways Concordat forces weren't. More importantly, vassal species began refusing orders. Torvin ships that were supposed to support the Concordat fleet instead held back. Kelvin vessels turned their weapons on Concordat command ships. The carefully controlled order the Concordat had maintained for thousands of years started falling apart. On the 4th day, with Concordat forces in disarray and uprisings beginning on vassal worlds across the galaxy, the High Council called for a ceasefire. They wanted to negotiate. Admiral Okonkwo met with the High Council in a secure location. He brought Sarah Chun and Vrix with him. The meeting was tense. Council members were angry and confused. They didn't understand what had happened. How had humans resisted tactics that had worked 847 times before? Sarah explained it to them. She said humans had used those exact tactics on each other for thousands of years. She described human history, the wars, the manipulation, the divide and conquer strategies, the colonization, the propaganda. Humans had invented most of the tricks the Concordat used, but humans had also learned from those mistakes. Slowly and painfully over centuries, humans had figured out that unity was stronger than division. They had learned to recognize manipulation. They had learned that their differences could be strengths instead of weaknesses if they worked together. The Concordat had tried to divide humans using human tactics. They never realized that humans had already moved past those tactics. It was like trying to fool a chess master with an opening gambit they had invented themselves. Okonkwo laid out humanity's terms. The Concordat would dissolve their vassalization system. Every species would regain full sovereignty. The Concordat would submit to a new galactic council where no species held absolute power. All species would have equal voices. The alternative, Okonkwo said, was continued war. But now the Concordat would be fighting hundreds of species working together instead of divided vassals they could control. Vrix added that her people would never stop fighting now that they knew the truth. Other vassal species representatives sent messages saying the same thing. The High Council had no real choice. Their military was fractured. Vassal species were rebelling. The humans had exposed everything. One by one, the council members agreed to the terms. The transition took years. The Concordat didn't disappear overnight. Many Concordat species struggled to accept their loss of power. They had spent thousands of years believing they were superior to the species they controlled. Learning equality was hard for them, but the former vassal species were determined. Humans helped coordinate the effort. They shared what they had learned about building unity from diversity. They mediated disputes. They helped establish the new Galactic Assembly, where every species had representation. 5 years after the Battle of Talaxis Prime, Sarah Chun stood before the Galactic Assembly to give a speech. The assembly hall was crowded with representatives from hundreds of species. Where the old Concordat banners had hung, new flags now hung representing the free species of the galaxy. Sarah talked about what humanity had learned. She said the lesson wasn't about human superiority. She explained that humans had made the same mistakes the Concordat made. They had divided themselves. They had conquered and exploited each other. They had caused terrible suffering through their conflicts. But humans had eventually learned that division was easy while building unity took work. They learned that differences between groups weren't weaknesses to exploit. They were perspectives to learn from. They learned that lasting strength came from cooperation, not domination. The Concordat had tried to teach humanity a lesson about power. Instead, humanity had taught the Concordat a lesson about wisdom. Power could maintain order through fear and division. But wisdom built something stronger through cooperation and mutual respect. In the back of the assembly hall, Krelix sat alone. He had been stripped of his ambassadorial rank. He was required to attend these sessions as part of his species' terms of peace. He watched humans helping former vassal species learn to govern themselves. He saw cooperation where he had always seen competition as inevitable. A human security officer noticed Krelix sitting alone and sat down beside him. The human asked if he understood now why the Concordat's tactics had failed. Krelix said bitterly that humans had simply been lucky. They had figured out the manipulation by chance. The human officer shook his head. He said it wasn't luck. He explained that human civilization was built on the lessons of 1,000 failed empires. Every human child learned about civilizations that had tried to rule through division and fear. They learned how those empires eventually collapsed. They learned that the same patterns repeated throughout history unless people paid attention and chose a different path. The Concordat had 10,000 years of success, but humans had 50,000 years of failure to learn from. And sometimes, the human said, the student who has failed becomes wiser than the teacher who has never been tested. Krelix had no response to that. He sat quietly and watched as the galaxy learned to build something new. Something the Concordat had never imagined was possible. A true federation where species worked together because they chose to, not because they were forced to. The lesson was complete. The Concordat had tried to divide humans using tactics as old as civilization itself. But humans had already learned those lessons the hard way. And history, as humans knew very well, had a way of teaching the same lessons over and over until someone finally listened.